Okay, welcome back to the tissue lecture. Today we're going to finish this up and start the integumentary system. So last week we talked about epithelial tissue. It's the tissue that is your skin. It lines all of your body cavities and your body and some of your organs. Connective tissue is going to connect the epithelium to the rest of the body. It's going to lie deep to that basement membrane that the epithelial tissue sits on top of and help connect it to all of the other structures of the body. It's a diverse group of supporting tissue. It can be liquid, it can be dense and solid, it can be things like bone and cartilage. So there's a lot of different things that are considered connective tissue. Connective tissue is made up of specialized cells. We're going to talk about each of those. It's made up of protein fibers and a ground substance, which is kind of viscous, jelly-like material known as a matrix. Connective tissue will never be exposed to the outside environment. In normal conditions, it's highly vascular, so there are a lot of blood vessels supplying this tissue, unlike epithelial tissue, which is avascular. And it contains sensory receptors, so we have a lot of sensation being felt through the connective tissue. So the connective tissue establishes our structural framework. It helps to transport fluids, protects our organs, supports, surrounds, and connects tissues, stores energy, and defends the body from pathogens. So it has very diverse functions. There are three different types of connective tissue. We have connective tissue proper. That has a lot of cells and ground substance, and there are two main types of connective tissue proper. Those are loose connective tissue and dense connective tissue. And we'll talk about subcategories of those as well. We have fluid connective tissue, which is a lot of cells, but less cells than the connective tissue proper, in a watery matrix. And we have two different types of fluid connective tissue, and those are blood and lymph. And then we have supporting connective tissue, which is densely packed fibers. There's cells, but there's less cells. And those two types are cartilage and bone. So those are all the things that we'll talk about today. So some of the cells that are found in connective tissues. There are some cells that are found in connective tissue that are for maintenance, repair, and energy storage, and those are the fibroblasts, fibrocytes, adipocytes, and mesenchymal cells, or mesenchymal cells. There are also some cells that function for defense and repair, and those are our macrophages, mast cells, lymphocytes, plasma cells, and microphages. Our fibroblasts are the only cells that are always present in connective tissue proper. They're going to secrete hyaluronin and proteins, and they will also help to make fibers that will make the tissue more dense and have its properties of elasticity and waterproofing abilities. Our fibrocytes are going to maintain the connective tissue fibers. Adipocytes are fat cells. They store one droplet of lipids each. Our mesenchymal cells are stem cells. They help by responding to injuries or infections by dividing and differentiating into certain types of other cells that might be necessary to fight said injury or infection. There are also melanocytes, and they secrete melanin to provide our skin and our tissues with pigment. Macrophages are going to engulf damaged cells and pathogens. Macrophages can either be fixed or free. If they're fixed, then they are kind of accumulated in one area for long periods of time. And if they're free, then they're free-floating, typically in the blood or tissues surrounding. Mast cells are going to be filled with histamine and heparin, and they help to kind of instigate local inflammation. And local inflammation is good. We want inflammation happening when there is injury or a pathogen present. It helps to bring blood flow to the area and kind of isolate that area from other tissues so that they will also not get injured or infected. Lymphocytes are a type of white blood cell. They can differentiate into plasma cells, which make antibodies. They also act as macrophages. And then we have microphages. Microphages are also other types of white blood cells. They tend to be smaller than lymphocytes, things like neutrophils. There are different types of fibers in connective tissue proper. We've got collagen, which is the most common fiber in connective tissue proper. It's super strong. It helps to make up our tendons and our ligaments. Tendons are going to connect muscle to bone, and ligaments are going to connect bone to bone, so they do have to be very strong. Reticular fibers stabilize the position of organs, blood vessels, and structures within the organs. Elastic fibers are made of a protein named elastin, so it helps to return structures to their original length after they've stretched. Ground substance will fill the space between cells and surround connective tissue fibers. It's viscous and it slows pathogens so that those macrophages and different other types of white blood cells can come along and attack the pathogen. So first we're going to start with our types of loose connective tissue. So remember that's our first type of connective tissue proper. Loose connective tissue will be the packing materials of our body. It kind of helps to fill the spaces between organs and support our epithelial tissue. We have 4 main types of loose connective tissue: mucous connective tissue, areolar tissue, adipose tissue, and reticular tissue. Our mucous connective tissue is also known as embryonic connective tissue. It's also known as mesenchyme. It's our first type of connective tissue to develop in embryos. It contains mesenchymal cells, which are a type of stem cell. Stem cells can differentiate into other types of cells that are needed. Our mucous connective tissue is also known as Wharton's jelly, and that can be found in the umbilical cord. Some scientists have been using those cells from that tissue lately to test their regenerative capabilities in generating new cells for people who are rehabbing from certain types of injuries. So there's a lot of cool new research coming out about that. Areolar tissue is the least specialized kind of connective tissue, so it's there for extra padding. It can be distorted without damage, so it sort of absorbs any shock or pressure without damaging the tissue itself. It has a pretty extensive blood supply. Adipose tissue is very similar to areolar tissue, but it's more composed of adipocytes. Adipocytes are fat cells, so this is going to be fat tissue. It provides padding, absorbs shock, and acts as insulation. So white fat versus brown fat is just a difference in color. Brown fat tends to be more vascularized, which gives it its darker color. Adults tend to have more white fat than brown fat, and they used to think that adults didn't have brown fat anymore, and that's something that they grow out of as they get older from childhood, as a lot of children have a lot of brown fat. But it turns out that most adults should have brown fat, and the absence of it could actually be determinant of obesity. Everybody has a predetermined number of fat cells. It comes from your genetics. Whether or not they are filled with lipids determines your actual body composition. So genetically, a genetic adaptation that humans have had is that regionally they have different numbers of fat cells that they are born with. So those who live in the north actually have more fat cells than those who live in the south that were born there and their ancestors were born there. And if your ancestors were from a Nordic country, you're more likely to have more fat cells, just because your body is preparing itself to insulate you from those temperatures. So just having a predetermined number of fat cells does not actually contribute to body fat. They have to be filled with lipids in order for them to contribute to body fat. When they are not filled with lipids, these cells are flattened. So that's kind of where liposuction comes into place. So liposuction is just a temporary fix for people who do not like the look of the body fat that they have. The problem is, since you have this predetermined number of cells, your stem cells can divide again to reaccount for that number of fat cells that you should have on your body due to genetics. So those fat cells can return. So again, when you lose weight, you're not losing fat cells. You are only getting rid of the lipids that are stored in them. The cells then would flatten. Reticular tissue is found in liver, kidneys, spleen, lymph nodes, and bone marrow. It's found in a lot of places that are built for filtration. It also provides a good supportive framework for these organs. So those were all loose connective tissues. Now we're going into dense connective tissues. So this is our second type of connective tissue proper. Dense connective tissues are also known as collagenous tissues because they are so filled with collagen. Our two different types of dense connective tissues are dense regular connective tissue and dense irregular connective tissue. Dense regular connective tissue is called that because they are regularly arranged. The fibers are arranged in parallel to one another. Some good examples of structures that have this dense regular connective tissue are tendons, ligaments, and aponeuroses. And we've already talked about tendons and ligaments, but aponeuroses are these tendinous sheets that attach these broad, flat muscles to bone. One good example is your Achilles tendon. Although it's called the tendon, it's actually an aponeurosis because it's quite large and flat, as is the muscle that it's attaching to the bone. Then we have dense irregular connective tissue, and it's called so because it's arranged irregularly. So it's kind of these random bundles of dense connective tissue. There's no consistent pattern. It helps to form things like our periosteum that covers bone, perichondrium that covers cartilage, capsules of organs, and it helps to give the dermis its strength. We also have elastic tissue. It's springy and resilient. It's found in the bladder, the larger blood vessels, erectile tissue of the penis, respiratory passageways, and elastic ligaments. So as you can see, it kind of resembles our dense regular connective tissue, but there are more elastic fibers throughout. So before we move on to our next types of connective tissue, we also have to talk about fascia, or fasciae, plural. So fascia is this connective tissue layer that supports and surrounds organs, and there's 3 different types. I don't care that you know the difference between these 3 types, but just know the 3 types of fascia are superficial, deep, and subserous. So we talked about connective tissue proper, our loose connective tissues, and our dense connective tissues. Now we're going to talk about our liquid connective tissues. So our 2 types of liquid connective tissues are blood and lymph. Blood is going throughout our blood vessels, and lymph is going throughout our lymph vessels. Lymph is something that you don't really hear about that often. It's part of your lymphatic system, and it helps to bring your fluids into balance in your body. So if you've got a lot of swelling in one area or edema, that's because there is an accumulation of lymph there. In your blood, it's separated into plasma and formed elements. Plasma is the liquid portion of your blood, and formed elements are the cells. So the formed elements would be your red blood cells, your white blood cells, and your platelets. They flow through your arteries, capillaries, and veins. Your arteries are going to carry blood away from the heart. Your veins are going to carry blood toward the heart. And your capillaries are going to be kind of lying in between your arteries and veins. So your arteries are carrying oxygenated blood. because it's coming from the heart and lungs where the blood has just been freshly oxygenated. Veins are going to carry deoxygenated blood back toward the heart and lungs to be oxygenated so that they can bring that to the tissues. And capillaries will be the exchange of this oxygenated and deoxygenated blood at the tissue level. So once the tissue has already used the oxygen that it received from the arteries, it will then take the deoxygenated blood, transport it to the veins, where it will travel back up to the heart. So those were our liquid connective tissues. Now we're going into our supporting connective tissues. Our first one is cartilage. So cartilage has this matrix with chondroitin sulfates, and it has chondrocytes, which are cartilage cells. Cartilage cells, chondrocytes, live within little spaces known as lacunae. Cartilage is avascular, so it receives its nutrients via diffusion, just like epithelia. It also has an anti-angiogenesis factor, which actually prevents blood vessels from forming in it. There's also been some research into this anti-angiogenesis factor in tumor research to try to prevent the tumors from supplying their own vascular supply. Cartilage is separated from other tissues by perichondrium, this fibrous sheath that kind of covers it. And there are 3 different types of cartilage that we'll talk about: hyaline cartilage, elastic cartilage, and fibrocartilage. Hyaline cartilage is our most common type of cartilage. It's called hyaline because the Latin form of that means like glass. So you can see that in the spaces beside the cells, it's glass-like. It almost looks like ice. Some examples of where hyaline cartilage may be found is the cartilage in your nose, your respiratory tract, between your ribs and sternum, and articular cartilage found at the joint level. Elastic cartilage is called so because it is resilient and flexible. It tends to be a yellow color. It's found in your external ear, so the part of the ear that you can see, the epiglottis, your middle ear, and the cartilages of the larynx. And lastly, we have fibrocartilage, which tends to be more tough and durable. It's good for shock absorption, it resists compression, and limits your movement. So all of the other cartilages are a little bit more flexible. You're able to kind of bend them and they return to their normal shape. If you were to bend your ear down towards your skull and let it go, it returns back. But fibrocartilage, it resists movement, it limits it. So things like your intervertebral discs in between your vertebrae, and your pubic symphysis, which lies in your pelvis to prevent your pelvis from splitting apart. So these things we want to maintain as little movement as possible and shock absorb to prevent damage to your bones. There are 2 different ways that cartilage grows. One model is this interstitial growth of cartilage. Cartilage will enlarge from within, where chondrocytes will divide and extend. So these daughter cells will start to secrete an additional matrix, so they move apart and expand the cartilage. This is really important during development and growth. Secondly, we have appositional growth of cartilage, where cartilage will start to gradually increase by adding to its outer surface. So cells in the perichondrium, or that fibrous sheath that covers the cartilage, will divide, forming chondroblasts. Chondroblasts form cartilage, so they'll produce this matrix which will turn into chondrocytes, and chondrocytes are the cells of the cartilage. Appositional growth can be abnormal because it can also occur due to injury or excess growth hormone, where your body will start to produce too much cartilage. Our second supportive connective tissue is bone. So about 2/3 of the bone matrix is calcified. So that's what gives it its tough texture. Just like in the chondrocytes in the cartilage, the osteocytes or bone cells sit in lacunae, these little divots, and the lacunae talk to each other via canaliculi. So they're these little canals so that the cells can communicate. There's also a central canal throughout the entire osteon. So the osteon is a series of concentric rings, kind of like if you were to cut a tree trunk in half and look at the stump, you would see these growth rings. That's kind of like what a bone looks like if you cut it open. You would see these concentric circles, and the entire concentric circle structure is known as an osteon. So within the osteon, you have a ton of osteocytes, little bone cells, connected via canaliculi. And right in the center of the osteon is a central canal with blood vessels to supply the entire osteon. Surrounding the entire bone is a periosteum, similar to a perichondrium, where it's going to allow for the bone to be separate from other tissues. It's a fibrous sheath. The periosteum is actually what causes pain when you have shin splints. The periosteum will kind of pull away from the bone and give a lot of pain because periosteum is highly innervated. So we also have tissue membranes. So this is another way that the body separates different types of tissues. We have mucous membranes, serous membranes, cutaneous membranes, and synovial membranes. Mucous membranes are also known as mucosae. They line passageways and chambers that open to the external environment. Some examples are throughout the digestive tract, urinary tract, respiratory tract, and reproductive tracts. They are usually wet, and they have to be so that they can avoid friction and facilitate secretion and absorption in these tissues. Next, we have serous membranes, and we've talked a little bit about this before because they line these internal cavities of the trunk. So the peritoneum is the serous membrane that's found in the abdomen, pleura are found surrounding the lung cavities, and pericardium surrounds the heart. So if they are a visceral serous membrane, they are going to attach directly to the organ, and if they are parietal portions, then they are going to attach directly to the body cavity wall itself. Typically, between these visceral and parietal portions, you'll have the serous fluid to prevent any friction from occurring between those different membranes. Cutaneous membranes are the membranes that coat your body, so your skin. These are keratinized stratified squamous epithelium, so they're water resistant. They're not technically waterproof. We'll talk about that when we get into the skin. They're thick, they like to be dry. And then synovial membranes will line your joint cavities, so between bones, so that the bones do not touch and cause pain. These synovial membranes secrete synovial fluid, so again, the synovial fluid will help to lubricate these joints to allow them to move in pain-free ranges of motion. So, as we said, cartilage is an avascular tissue. And in order for the joints to get their nutrients, they do so by the movement of this synovial fluid. So in order for your cartilage in the joint itself to receive any nutrients, you have to keep moving. So if somebody is immobile for long periods of time, or a certain body part is immobile for long periods of time, that joint can degenerate because it's not getting enough nutrients from the movement of that synovial fluid. Okay, next we have muscle tissue. So this is our third type of tissue. We talked about epithelial tissues, connective tissues. Next we have muscle tissue. So muscle tissue is specialized for movement and contraction. Those are its two main functions. We have three different types of muscle tissue: skeletal muscle, cardiac muscle, and smooth muscle. Skeletal muscle are the muscles that are found within your body. It's the ones that you would think of when you would flex a muscle, your biceps, your triceps. The muscles that are going to help you move voluntarily. Those are your skeletal muscles. The individual muscle cells themselves are called muscle fibers, which may be counterintuitive because fibers don't sound like cells, but that's what they're called. They're produced by myosatellite cells, which are a type of stem cell. They are striated because they have this striped appearance. They're multinucleate, so the cells have multiple nuclei, and they are voluntary, so you have to think about flexing them or moving them, at least subconsciously, in order to allow movement to occur. Cardiac muscle is found strictly in the heart. It's striated because, again, it has this striped appearance. It's involuntary because you don't have to think about your heart pumping. And it has what's called intercalated discs. So if you see these little vertical lines throughout, those are intercalated discs. Those help with electrical signaling throughout the heart. It allows our heart to beat. Cardiac muscle has limited repair capabilities. And it doesn't rely on nerve activity. That's why it has these pacemaker cells so that they can set the rate of contraction. Smooth muscle is the muscle that's found in all of our organs, other than the heart, of course. Things like your digestive tract that are helping to move food along to be digested. They have to do so by the use of this smooth muscle. It's also found in your blood vessel walls to help pump blood along to the rest of your body. Smooth muscle can divide and regenerate after injury. It can repair itself. It's non-striated because it does not have this striped appearance, which is why it's called smooth. And it's involuntary because, again, you don't have to think about digesting your food and things of that nature. And our fourth type of tissue is nervous tissue. So it's specialized for sending electrical impulses. The different types of cells in the nervous tissue are neurons and neuroglia, and we'll talk way more about this when we get to the nervous system. Neurons are the main cells of the nervous system. They're also the longest cells in the body. Their components are these cell bodies with a large nucleus in the middle. Typically, they have dendrites that come off of the cell body. Sometimes they don't, though. They kind of vary in their structures depending on where they are and what their job is. The dendrites will touch other neurons so that they can communicate with them. They have a long center section called an axon. Sometimes they have more than one. And the axon is where the electrical impulse will travel down. And then at the end, there's more dendrites with synaptic bulbs at the end. So at these synaptic bulbs, that's where neurotransmitters can be released to contact other neurons and communicate with them chemically. And neuroglia cells are the helper cells of the nervous system. And we'll talk way more about that again when we get to the nervous system. Okay, so inflammation is when your body kind of isolates an injured area that has damaged structures, or maybe it has pathogens, maybe you have an infection of some sort. So it isolates that area by maybe swelling with edema or redness and sometimes even pus formation. But it's your body's way of isolating that area. Local inflammation and inflammation that happens in an acute circumstance, maybe right after an injury, is good. It's good for your body to have that so that you can bring local circulation to that area so that white blood cells can fight off whatever it is that's going on, can repair the damaged tissue. Inflammation that lasts longer than that acute period will contribute to pain long term. So we don't want chronic inflammation. That's not good for you. Acute is. Necrosis is when this tissue starts to kind of break down and decay. Pus is an accumulation of dead white blood cells or pathogens, just kind of debris in general. If it has a yellow-like color, that's typically due to dead neutrophils specifically. And an abscess is an accumulation of pus in a specific area. So all of these tissues have varying levels of regenerative capabilities. It really just depends on the tissue itself. Like the nervous system does not really like to repair itself. The heart really doesn't like to repair itself. It really depends on the type of tissue. Your skin repairs itself all the time. So some of these tissues that don't repair themselves well, sometimes those will repair with scar tissue or what's known as fibrosis. So that's why it's kind of difficult for somebody that had a heart attack to recover, because their heart tissue, like we said, doesn't really like to repair itself. So instead of its normal cardiac tissue, it's going to repair itself with this dense, irregular connective tissue in fibrosis, scar tissue. And scar tissue is going to have a really hard time conducting electrical impulses like the heart would do. So that can be difficult. Sometimes if you injure a muscle or a tendon or a ligament, it can result in this fibrosis as well. So it depends on how your body repairs itself. But with fibrosis, just know that your body will likely not be, whatever was injured is probably not doing the same function it was prior to the injury. But not everything repairs itself with fibrosis. With age, the speed in which you recover and the effectiveness in which you recover with your tissues decreases. The tissues become more fragile, you're more likely to bruise because your blood vessels are more fragile. And what else is fragile is your bones, so you can become osteoporotic. One thing to really keep in mind to kind of prevent osteoporosis is to remain doing weight-bearing activity. So there's a law in which we'll talk about when we get to the skeletal system, where when you put force on your bones, so say lifting weights, or if you're running on a hard surface, that impact, it helps to build bone over time. And that might be counterintuitive because you might think that you're injuring your bone, but even with injuring bone, it grows back stronger than it was before. So you want impact, you want force, and you want to keep maintaining that type of activity to keep your bones strong over time. However, if you've never exercised, you probably shouldn't start with like heavy weightlifting when you're 80. Just work your way up to being able to do more weight-bearing activity. And cancer rates also increase with age because of the limited repair activity that your tissues do. Sometimes they get it wrong. Sometimes there's mutations that occur. And sometimes it's because people have been exposed to so many environmental toxins over time. So according to research, about 1 in 4 people will have cancer in the United States at some point in their lives. That could be cancer anywhere. It could be a benign cancer that doesn't affect you really that much, but 1 in 4 is a pretty big chance, and as it increases with age, just keep that in mind, that there are things that you can do to try to prevent different types of cancers. When we get into the integumentary system, a big thing is wearing sunscreen. I know it sounds crazy, but it really works, and it will help to prevent you from UV radiation, which, as we will see, is the number 1 risk factor for developing skin cancer. So wear your sunscreen and try to prevent taking in a lot of free radical causing foods, like processed foods, as they can cause mutations over time as well.